Good evening, all of you. It's very nice to be amongst you all in these difficult times. Thanks to the technology that we are able to interact or at least communicate between us and enrich ourselves with more legal acumen because of these webinars which have been going on. And there were some questions on the choice of the topic. Some people ask me why I chose this topic. I must confess that this topic is very dear to me. And as an appellate side lawyer for more than 30 years, I have come across many situations where this law has, in fact, fascinated me. And after the advent of the various state legislations in the late 80s and the early 90s, which brought in an amendment to the Hindu Succession Act, thereby enabling the daughters of a Kopasana to succeed as Kopasanas. That is giving them a right by birth. I thought that there was a resurgence of the conventional litigation in the form of partition suits. Before that storm created by the state amendments could die down, then came the Act 39 of 2005, the central law, which introduced an amendment, a very vital amendment to Section 6, which made daughters of a Kopasana as Kopasanas with him. This is, again, if I may say so, renewed the interest in the traditional Sastric Hindu law as well as the Hindu Succession Act. Now, when we say succession or law of succession regarding Hindus, we are reminded of the legislation that came in 1956, namely the Hindu Succession Act. All of us know that there were some predecessors to this enactment. I'll just give a brief outlay of these predecessor enactments so that we'll have a complete picture of how the law developed in India. To my knowledge, law of succession among Hindus was made a subject matter of legislation for the first time in 1850 by the introduction of the Caste Disabilities Removal Act 1850. This change or this law enabled converts to succeed to the estate of a Hindu. However, the descendants of a convert were precluded from such succession. That law is now crystallized as Section 26 of the Hindu Succession Act 1956. A little later, maybe 2 decades later, we had the Hindu Wills Act 1870, which enabled Hindus to dispose of their properties by way of a testamentary instrument. The law of wills or the execution of wills was quite unknown to Hindu law in the early days. The Madras Presidency came up with the Hindu Transfer of Bequests Act in 1914, where the again this related to disposition of property by a Hindu by way of a testamentary instrument or a will as we call it. These two enactments were coupled together and there came the Hindu Disposition of Property Act 1916, Thereafter, when the Indian Succession Act was enacted in 1925, these provisions were incorporated in the said enactment. Then came the Hindu Removal of Disabilities Act, Hindu Inheritance Removal of Disabilities Act, which enabled lunatics and idiots to succeed. There was, if I may say so, a major development in Hindu law in the year 1937 with the introduction of the Hindu Women's Right to Property Act. This act, which was introduced shortly after the Government of India Act came into force in 1935, was enacted by the Government of India. This act gave limited rights to widows or wives of Kopasanas in the property of their husbands, equal to that of a son. But there was a rider which said that these rights will be limited rights. That is, the widow will have a right to enjoy till her lifetime, and she will be precluded from alienating the properties, except for necessities. There was a reference to the federal court under section 213 of the Government of India Act to test the to test the legislative competence of the Government of India to enact such a legislation, because law relating to agricultural land was a subject matter of the state list or the presidential list under the Government of India Act. When this reference went before the federal court concluded that this piece of legislation would be valid only in respect of non-agricultural properties, since the Union, namely the Government of India, did not have the right to enact in respect of agricultural lands, which was a state subject. This judgment of the Federal Court was reported in AIR 1941 Federal Court, page 72. This was closely followed by Umayalachi's case in AIR 1945 Federal Court, page 25, wherein the judgment in 1941 Federal Court was upheld or approved. After these two judgments of the federal court came in, the state legislatures, namely the presidencies, started enacting laws giving a limited right to Hindu widows. The Madras Presidency enacted Act 26 of 1947. While enacting the said law, the law was given a retrospective effect for a limited period. That is, it was applicable to the estates of Hindus, male Hindus who died after 26/11/1946. This limited retrospective effect given to the enactment was tested before the Madras High Court in 1955 to MLJ, page 302. An argument was developed that since this is an amending legislation or a subsidiary legislation which extends the 1937 Act, extends the applicability of the 1937 Act to agricultural lands also, this law should be given a retrospective effect from the date of the parent enactment, namely the 1937 Hindu Women's Right to Property Act, passed by the Union of India. That argument was repelled by the division bench of the Madras High Court, and the division bench held that this act will have only a limited retrospective effect, that is from 26/11/1946. Therefore, only widows of those male Hindus who died after 26/11/1946 would acquire a limited right to agricultural properties of their husbands. Then this limited right, which was given in 1937 and 1947, was enlarged into an absolute right by enacting Section 14 of the Hindu Succession Act 1956. Of course, Section 14 was a subject matter of several judicial pronouncements. Of course, the dust has settled in now. Now we are in for a more clearer interpretation of Section 14 after Tulasamma's case. I will deal with it a little later. Then came the Hindu Succession Act 1956. If you look at the objects and reasons of the enactment, the Hindu Succession Act says rather, it is to codify and amend the law relating to succession among Hindus. So it is not to abrogate the law, it is to codify and amend the law relating to Hindus. This act was enacted in 1956 and it was extended to the territory of Pondicherry in 1963 when Pondicherry was ceded to India by France. This act, while codifying the law or amending and codifying the law, introduced certain changes in the matter of succession to the property, the Kopassaneri property held by a Hindu family. There were some minor changes in the pattern of succession. I call them minor changes intentionally because the major changes came in subsequently. Then Section 14 was enacted. Then we had Section 15 to govern the rules of succession for a estate of a female Hindu. Then we had 26, which dealt with conversion. Then 22, which gave a preemptive right. Then 30, which enabled disposal of property by testamentary instruments. All these things were provided for. This act was, however, the Central Act itself said it will not apply to scheduled tribes. It will apply to Hindu, Sikh, or Jaina who has been included in the definition of a Hindu. And also, when the Pondicherry was ceded to India, and this act was extended to Pondicherry from 1/10/1963, Section 2 capital A was introduced. That section excluded the applicability of this enactment to Renaissance in Pondicherry. The question arose, who are Renaissance? There are some judgments of the Madras High Court which say any person born in Pondicherry or a native of Pondicherry is a Renaissance. That view has been held to be incorrect. In 2016, 4 MLJ, page 562, Honorable Justice Ram Subramaniam examined the scope of the word Renaissance and after referring to the French legal system that was existing in India, he concluded that not every person born or every native of Pondicherry is a Renaissance. When the French occupied Pondicherry, they wanted these natives to accept their legal system. Therefore, they offered incentives to people who would renounce the applicability of the Indian legal system or the native legal system and adopt the French legal system. So these people were willing to renounce the applicability of the local law were called Renaissance. They were asked to exercise an option, and for exercising the option, incentives were given by the French government. These you will find in the book written by Dr. Justice David Anuswamy on the French legal system in India. He has in detail explained how this Renaissance came into being and who are these Renaissance. So these Renaissance are persons who had relinquished the applicability of the local law and has chosen to abide by the French law. These are called the Renaissance. Therefore, a native of Pondicherry who had not exercised that option and who had remained an Indian or a native and after 1963 become an Indian citizen is not a Renaissance. So this is regarding applicability of the act to certain group of people in Pondicherry. Then there was another question whether this customary Hindu law which was in vogue in other parts of India would apply to Pondicherry also. Then they said no, that will not apply. The Coromandel Hindu law, which is called the Coromandel law, the Hindu law that prevailed in the Coromandel coast would prevail in Pondicherry. That Coromandel Hindu law does not recognize a right by birth to a son or a daughter. And it is the father is the absolute owner of the property. That was the law that was existing in Pondicherry prior to 1963. But there is some recent development where the Madras High Court has taken the view that Mitakshara law would also apply to the Karaikal region of Pondicherry because that formed part of the original Chola territory. As we know, Pondicherry is comprised of 4 different regions. 2 in Tamil Nadu, namely Pondicherry and the Karaikal region, 1 in Andhra Pradesh, namely the Yenam, and the other in Kerala, namely Mahe. So, recently, Honorable Justice Satish Kumar has examined the position of law and he has concluded that insofar as Karaikal region is concerned, there is no evidence of the application of the so-called Coromandel Hindu law. And they continue to follow the Mitakshara law. Let us not get into that, that is a different topic by itself. But now proceeding further, now the fulcrum is section 4. The fulcrum of Hindu Succession Act is section 4 of the Act. Section 4, if we could read, it gives a limited overriding effect to the Act over the customary Hindu law. It says that any text, rule, or interpretation of Hindu law or usage as a part of that law in force immediately before the commencement of this Act shall cease to have effect in respect of matters for which a provision has been made under this Act. And class B, any law or usage which was in force immediately before the commencement of the Act shall cease to apply to Hindus insofar as it is inconsistent with the provisions of this Act. Therefore, a limited overriding effect is given. If there is an inconsistency between the practice and what is provided under the Act would prevail. If there is no inconsistency, then the old law also will prevail. Old law will prevail. Therefore, then what is the effect of section 4? The effect of section 4 is that interstate succession among Hindus will be governed by the provisions of this Act. Any practice that had been there, any customary law that was in vogue prior to 1956 would cease to apply to Hindus insofar as it is inconsistent with the provisions of the Act. Then the next important section is section 6. Here I will just give a brief outline of the provisions of the Act, then get into the intricacies. The following sections will be very important sections of this enactment. That is, the most important one is section 6, which provides for devolution of interest in co-personary property. Then section 8, this is the new deviation. Section 8 is the, can we call it as an innovation in 1956. Section 8 classifies the heirs of a male Hindu into class 1, class 2, those who inherit. And there are two schedules which define class 1 and class 2 heirs. Section 8 provides for general rules of succession in the case of a male Hindu, that is, the property will devolve on his class 1 heirs. In the absence of class 1 heirs, it will go to class 2 heirs. And section 9 provides for succession, how they will take it. Section 8 defines class 1 and class 2. Section 9 says class 1 will take. The class 1 contains various entries like mother, widow, son, daughter, son of a predeceased son, daughter of a predeceased daughter, son of a predeceased daughter of a predeceased son, son of a predeceased daughter. It goes on. There are about 16 heirs who come with their class 1. These class 1 heirs would take the property simultaneously. That is, if a male Hindu dies intestate, leaving behind property, that is self-acquired property, it will devolve on his class 1 heirs equally. Then the next section is section 10. Section 10 provides for distribution of the property. 9 says all the heirs in class 1 will take simultaneously. Then what happens is, if there is one son and two sons of a predeceased son, can we say it is 1/3 each? No. That is where 10 steps. 10 will lay down the rules of succession or distribution of the property which is inherited under 9. 9 provides for inheritance, 10 gives you the rules for distribution. The rules for distribution is that the heirs of one particular heir will take it together. Suppose, I'll give you a very simple example. I will not read the section because I am addressing lawyers. I will not read the section. I will put it as an example. A dies, leaving behind a son and two children of a predeceased son. How this property of A will be divided? It will be divided into two, because the son will get one share. These children of the predeceased son will get the other share. I think I made it very clear. Therefore, this was a subject matter of a conversation in a movie. I think Vikram was the hero, and where Vadivel will say, "Your father is a fool. He begot 4 sons. My father is an intelligent fellow. He begot only me. Therefore, I will get one share. All the 4 of you together will get one share." That is what section 10 says. So this is section 10. Then section 11 is for distribution in heirs in class 2 heirs. Class 2 heirs do not take it simultaneously. As far as class 2 heirs are concerned, the one in the first entry excludes the others. The first entry is the father. If the father of the deceased is alive, he excludes all the others. Then the second entry is the mother. Then brothers and sisters. Like that, brothers' children. Like that it goes. So as far as class 2 is concerned, if there is one heir in the first entry, the others don't get it. So if the father is alive, the others don't get it. If the entry they take the second entry, if the first heir in the second entry is alive, then others don't get it. If you take the first entry in class 2 is father. The second entry is son's daughter's son, son's daughter's daughter, brother, sister. All the 4 will take it equally. If anyone found in the second entry is available, then it will not pass on to the third entry, it will stop there. That is regarding class 2. Then section 12 between agnates and coagnates. Then section 14. This is a very important section again. This provides for enlargement of the estate. Then 14.1 and 14.2. 14.1 deals with the property obtained by a female Hindu by way of succession or otherwise, where she gets a limited right, will enlarge into her absolute property. Then section 2 is like a proviso to subsection 1. Subsection 2 says if the female Hindu has obtained the property under an instrument and that instrument prescribes a limited estate, then that property will not, that limited estate will not blossom into an absolute estate. This was subject matter of several judgments. And finally, we had Tulasamma. I will explain to you a little later. Then section 15. 15 deals with succession for a female Hindu. There again, certain very interesting provisions are made in 15. 15.1 provides who are the heirs of a female Hindu. That is her children, firstly upon. See, this is like class 2 of a male Hindu. A female Hindu succession is like class 2 of a male Hindu succession. You take firstly upon, you see the section itself, it says firstly upon her children and her husband. Then secondly upon the heirs of her husband. Thirdly upon her parents, mother and father. Fourthly upon the heirs of the father. So, firstly, secondly, thirdly, fourthly, what do you get by this? First, if there is somebody in the first entry available, the second entry will not get it. Like class 2 for a male Hindu. Then next, going to 2. 15.2 is a very important provision there again. If you look at 15.2, 15.2 makes two exceptions. One is if the property is inherited by a female Hindu from her parents and she dies without issues, it will not go to her husband or his heirs. It will go to her parents' heirs. So there is a reversion provided here. Similarly, if she had inherited from her husband and in the absence of her heirs, it will go to her husband's other heirs, like her father and mother. If you look at it, any property inherited by a female Hindu from a mother, father or mother shall devolve in the absence of any son or daughter, of the deceased. The language is very, very, very important. Son or daughter of the deceased, including the children of any predeceased son or daughter, not upon the other heirs referred to in subsection 1, but but upon the heirs of the father. So, if she had got it from her father or mother in the absence of her children, it will not go to her husband or her husband's heirs. It will go to her father or her father's heirs. Next is the husband's property. Husband or father-in-law. If she had inherited from the husband or father-in-law, then the source from which the property came determines the succession. That is the basis. There is a very laudable provision. Then 16 for succession and manner of distribution among the heirs of female Hindu. I already told you that is it is like class 2. It is not like class 1, it is like class 2. Then section 20 provides for right to a child in the womb at the time of death of a male Hindu. That is in recognition of the Shastric Hindu law. And 22 provides a preferential right to acquire property, that is basically with an intention to retain the property within the family. And 23 and 24 have now been repealed. They dealt with rights of female heirs in dwelling houses, residential dwelling houses, but that has now been repealed. And 25 and 26 disqualify murderers and descendants of a convert from inheriting the property. I already told you this. Then 30, another important provision, that is the result of the Hindu Wills Act. Then that 1870 enactment which we saw is now part of the 1956 Act in the form of section 30. And now let us go to the details. Now Taking section 6. Section 6 as it stood prior to the amendment. Before going in detail on section 6, I would like to make one thing very clear. There is a general impression that this Hindu Succession Act had abrogated the Shastric Hindu law. It has abolished the co-parcenary system. Please remember that that is not the object of the Act, and the Act never intended to do that also. Please take a look at section 6. Section 6, as the old section 6 stood, it very clearly says that the property of a Kopasana, will devolve. See, this equal rights to daughters were all added subsequently. Section 6 prior to the amendment was that the property of a Kopasana will devolve by survivorship and not under the provisions of this Act. That was the old section. But there was a proviso to it. The proviso said, if a male Hindu dies after the commencement of the Act, leaving a class 1 female heir or a male heir claiming under such female heir, then his interest in the Miktakshara Kopassanari will not devolve by survivorship, but it will devolve under the provisions of this Act. So the catch is in the words, his interest in the Miktakshara Kopassanari. What is that his interest in the Miktakshara Kopassanari? Explanation 1 to old section 6 explained what is his interest in the Miktakshara Kopassanari. His interest in the Miktakshara Kopassanari is the property that would have been allotted to him if a partition had taken place just prior to his death. That is what is called a theory of notional partition. Suppose a male Hindu dies leaving behind property of a Kopassanari property. Then we will have to first find out what is his interest in the Miktakshara Kopassanari property. How do you find out what is his interest in the Miktakshara Kopassanari property? Assume a partition just prior to his death. That was the explanation. Assume a partition just prior to his death. Then you carve out his interest in the Miktakshara Kopassanari property. I'll give you a simple example. Suppose a male Hindu dies leaving behind his widow and one son and a daughter. Let's have a very simple example so that I will not confuse you. As A dies leaving behind his wife W and X and Y, a son and a daughter. Now he has left behind property in the form of an interest in the Miktakshara Kopassanari property. So who are the Kopassanas? Prior to the amendment, he and his son. So now you should find out what is the interest of A. Then assume a partition between A and X. A gets one share, X gets one share. So half share goes to A, half share goes to X. Then this half share of A is his interest in the Miktakshara Kopassanari. And that would devolve under the provisions of this Act, namely under section 8. Then go to section 8. Who are the class 1 heirs? The wife, son and daughter. All the three of them will classify to be class 1 heirs. So this half will again go to the 3. So 1/6 each. Now what happens is the son gets 1/2 as the Kopasana, then this 1/6 as a class 1 heir. Therefore, the son will get 4/6 share, whereas the widow and the daughter will get 1/6 share. This was the position prior to in Tamil Nadu 1989, all over India 2005. Then the change. Then this what was the change introduced? What was the change introduced by this section 6? That is the proviso. We said the wife and the daughter as well as the mother of a male Hindu who dies leaving an interest in the Miktakshara Kopassanari will take a share in the property of that man. There, of course, it was a very limited share because the sons got a lion's share as Kopasanas as well as last one heirs. Then notional partition came. Then here I must, this I will explain to you a little later, but you have to remember that the son gets two different kinds of properties. One as a Kopasanar, he gets half share, and the other as a class 1 heir of his father, he gets the remaining 1/6 share. So there are two kinds of properties in the hands of the son now. I'll explain what happens because of this. Now let us stop here for the moment. Then another important question that would arise is, as I said, has the 1956 Act put an end to Kopassanari? Can we say that any son or daughter born after 1956 will not become a Kopasana? The concept of right by birth, that is the essential, what you call a predominant feature of the Hindu succession, has been abrogated totally. This question came up again and again. Of course, there are some decisions of the Supreme Court which said that a son or daughter born after 1956 will not become Kopasanas. But there are some decisions which say that they would become Kopasanas. Now, let me tell you what is the object of the Act. The object of the Act is to amend and codify. Codify and amend. Codify and amend. This was not the intention of the legislature or the intention of the enactment to abrogate Kopassanari or abolish the concept of right by birth. In fact, Section 6 protected the concept of right by birth when it said his interest shall devolve. Otherwise, if he has no female heirs, the property will devolve by survivorship. That is, under the Shastric Hindu law, right by birth concept was accepted or approved. Then, even when it comes to his interest in the Miktakshara Kopassanari, then that alone would devolve under 8. Therefore, the concept of right by birth was in fact protected by the 1956. And I would say without fear of contradiction that neither the state enactments introduced between 1986 and 1994, starting with Andhra and ending with Karnataka, the last was Bombay. The several states enacted these amendment acts. None of them abrogated the concept of right by birth. In fact, it was strengthened by giving that right to the daughters also. Therefore, the right by birth concept has been protected. Now, if you look at the 1966 law, 1956 law, this conflict has come in. Let me tell you very quickly these three judgments, that is Sheila Devi versus Lalchand, 2007, 1 MLJ, page 797. Then Banwar Singh versus Puran, 2008, 3 SCC, page 87. And Yogendra and others versus Leelamma and others, 2009, 7 MLJ, 1086. These three judgments take the view that a son or daughter born after 1956 would not become a Kopasana. Of course, the contra view is there in Dharma Shamarao Agwale versus Pandurang Miragu Aglave in 1988, 2 SCC, page 126. Then Askaur versus Katar Singh, 2007, 5 SCC, 561. Then Rohit Chauhan versus Surinder Singh, 2013, 9 SCC, page 419. And Prakash versus Pulavati, 2015, 8 MLJ, page 115. These four cases, they say that a son or daughter born after 1956 would continue to be Kopasanas, would have the right by birth. They will be entitled to take the right by birth. Of course, all these cases, it was the sons and not the daughters. But now with the amendment that had come into force, the daughters will also take a share. they will have a right by birth. But a very peculiar thing happened in the Supreme Court. There was a reference of this very question to a larger bench in Ballar Singh versus Sarwan Singh and another. A two-judge bench of the Supreme Court noted these conflicting views and said, let this be referred to the larger bench. But when the matter came up before the larger bench, the appeal itself was withdrawn by the parties as settled, and it was allowed to be withdrawn without deciding the question of law. Therefore, we are left with this conflicting views on this question even today. And fortunately, in Uttam versus Saubhag Singh, the Supreme Court had said that a son or daughter born after 1956 would also get a right by birth to the property of the father, except the property got by him under Section 8. Therefore, the concept of right by birth has not been totally abrogated. Of course, a reading of Uttam versus Saubhag Singh would appear that a cursory reading of the decision would appear that it concurs with the view in Sheila Devi. But if you look at para 21 or 23 where the law is summarized, I think point number 4 or 6 of the judgment very clearly says that it is this right by birth concept is protected and it is available to children born after 1956 also. Then this position of law, in fact, Uttam's case affirms or approves the decision of a full bench of the Madras High Court in Additional Commission of Income Tax versus P.L. Karuppan Chettiar, reported in AIR 1979 Madras page 1. This Karuppan Chetti's case was approved by the Supreme Court in Commissioner of Wealth Tax Kanpur versus Chandrasen, reported in 1986 3 SCC page 567. In Karuppan Chettiar's case, the Madras High Court noted the difference in the types of properties that are inherited by the son. And subsequently, in Shyam Narayan Prasad versus Krishna Prasad, reported in 2018 7 SCC 646, again a two-judge bench of the Supreme Court has said that the right by birth survives even after 1956. The position of law. This position has been reiterated in the latest judgment, that is in 2018, in Shyam Narayan Prasad versus Krishna Prasad. So the conflict still survives, and you can also refer to my judgment in 2017 4 MLJ 571 for further clarity, where I have dealt with both Uttam as well as the other three cases which took the opposite view. And I have invoked the theory enunciated in 1987 Patna, AIR 1987 Patna, page 100, a full bench judgment of the Patna High Court, where it said, when there are two conflicting decisions of co-equal benches of the Supreme Court, the High Court can do whichever judgment is more appropriate to the facts of the case. Whichever judgment appears to the High Court to be more appropriate. I can put it like this. So I took shelter under that and I said that, right, but as we can see, if this law that children born after 1956 will not get a right by birth is accepted, then all the state enactments between 1986 and 1984, those amendments which conferred a right on daughters for the first time to become Kopasanas or to get a right by birth along with their fathers, as well as Act 39 of 2005, will become totally redundant because we are now in 2020 and this law was enacted in 2005. If you are going to say a daughter born after 1956 will not get a right by birth, then this act, which is enacted nearly after 51 years, sorry, in 2005, that is nearly after 49 years, are we going to say that only a 50-year-old daughter will get a right and the other daughters won't get a right? That will lead to anomalous results. That's why the an interpretation which would render several state amendments as well as a central amendment osseous may not be acceptable. That would be my opinion on this. Then going to the amendments introduced by the Tamil Nadu Act 1 of 1990. Andhra came with the Act in 1986, followed shortly by Tamil Nadu in 1989, which is called Act 1 of 1980, which introduced Section 29A, which gave equal rights to a daughter, that is, conferred a right by birth on a daughter of a Kopasana. Then what is that right by birth that was conferred? Then there were two exceptions made. The section very clearly said a daughter of a Kopasana will get an equal share as the son. That's all. Blanket law. There were two exemptions. One is a daughter married prior to 25/3/89. Here again, the act was given a limited retrospective effect from 25/3/1989. A daughter married before 25/3/1989 was excluded from the applicability of the act, and any partition that had taken place prior to that date was also saved. So therefore, a partition had taken place between the sons and the father on 20th of March 1989. The act came into force on 25/3/1989. The daughter cannot sue to reopen that partition. That partition was saved. So a partition that took place prior to 25/3/89 was saved. Partition or any alienation that took place prior to 25/3/89 was saved, and the daughter who got married prior to 25/3/1989 was disqualified from claiming a right by birth. So two conditions is one, there should not have been a partition in the family, and the daughter claiming should not have been married. So these two exceptions were made. Then the question arose, and what is the partition? What is meant by that word partition? Because partition means what we under the old law, the concept was when there is a disruption of the joint family, there is a partition. A notice conveying an intention to get out of the co-passionary itself amounted to disruption of the joint family. Therefore, the question arose, what is the meaning of the word partition used in Section 29 capital A of the Tamil Nadu Act? Essentially, this question came up for consideration in Sundarambal's case before Honorable Justice Srinivasan. The learned judge invoked the Shastric old law and said there was a preliminary decree that was passed. So he said once a preliminary decree is passed, there is a disruption in the status of the joint family. Therefore, there is a partition. Therefore, the daughter cannot claim. He concluded. And the daughter's appeal was dismissed. It was held that she will not be entitled to claim under this act. Of course, in Sundarambal's case, on a different ground also, she was disqualified. I will come to that a little later. On the partition, this was the view taken. But the Honorable Supreme Court, in Sai Reddy versus Narayan Reddy, a case arising from Andhra Pradesh, which contained a similar provision as 29 capital A of the Tamil Nadu Act, concluded that a partition means a complete partition by metes and bounds. In the absence of a complete partition by metes and bounds, the daughter cannot be held to be disentitled to the benefits of the act. Then, on the same question arose in another case, that is Shanmugadayar versus Sivanandam in 1993, before a bench headed by Justice Srinivasan this time. The division bench said, of course, one of us had decided in Sundarambal like this, but the Supreme Court has subsequently come up with this view. Therefore, In Sundara, in Shanmugadya's Sivanandam, it was held that the partition must be a partition by the form of a final decree or a registered written instrument. This was, but when the Central Act came, it took care. It said it should be a final degree or a registered instrument. Therefore, that this confusion was avoided by the central enactment when it came. But the legislator took care to see that this confusion does not persist. And then Section 29B of the Tamil Nadu Act provided for that the property will go back to the remaining members of the Kopassanari if the daughter who gets the property as a Kopasana dies without issues. That's something akin to 15.2, which I already explained. Then came the Hindu Succession Amendment Act 39 of 2005. We all know the provisions. Section 6 was amended. A daughter was given an equal share with that of a son. She was made a co-partner with her father, and the only exception was a partition that had taken place, partition or alienation that had taken place prior to 2012-2004. A daughter married prior to that date was also allowed to become a co-partner under the Central Act. Then this created this act came into force in the year 2005. That is on 9/9/2005, the act came into force. Then the question arose that as to whether this enactment is prospective or retrospective. This arose even for Act 1 of 89. I will deal with both together. Even for Act 1 of 89, the same question arose. Here also the same question arose, whether these acts are prospective or retrospective. That's why I said you please remember that the 1947 Act was given a limited retrospective effect, and 1955 Madras, 55 1MRJ, where the division bench said the limited retrospective effect will be there, it can't be given a further retrospective effect. The reasons given by the division bench was that on the death of the father, prior to that date, that is November 1946, I think it was 27/11/1946, which he saw. Prior to that date, if the father had died and the property has vested in the sons in shares, there was no provision to divest the property in the new enactment. Similar is the situation here. There is, of course, the Act enables a laudable enactment. The Act enables or confers a new right on the daughters. But it does not improve the position of a widow. The position of a widow remains the same. Now the daughter has been made a co-partner. Now if you look at the new section 6, new section 6 subsection 3 is the proviso to the old section 6. The very same theory of notional partition and ascertainment of interest of the male Hindu in the Mitakshara co-partnership are all incorporated under the new section 6. Then if you are going to do that, ascertain his interest in the Mitakshara co-partnership. So if a male Hindu dies leaving behind one son and one daughter after 9/9/2005, and his daughter becomes a co-partner along with him, again under subsection 3 of the new section 6, you have to ascertain his interest in the Mitakshara co-partnership. What is his interest in the Mitakshara co-partnership? That is 1/3 for himself, 1/3 for his son, and 1/3 for his daughter. Earlier we saw it was 1/2 for him and 1/2 for his son. Now it is 1/3 for himself, 1/3 for his wife, 1/3 for his son and 1/3 for his daughter. Now this 1/3 which he gets in the notional partition will again devolve on his class 1 heirs, namely his widow, his son and his daughter. So the widow's share will become 1/9. Of course, the legislation was to benefit a daughter, but the legislation resulted in a position where the widow's share is lessened. And if you make this enactment retrospective, what happens? Suppose a person dies in 2003, 1/1/2003, let us say. He has died. So as on that date, section 6 was old section 6. You apply old section 6, his son and himself will get half of, then that half will go to his class owners, namely his widow, his daughter, and his son. So 1/6. So the widow has got 1/6. She becomes legally the owner of that 1/6 on that date, and her husband died. And if you are going to apply the amended section 6 and reopen, not reopen, apply and divide, what happens? The widow's share gets reduced to 1/9. Does that law contemplate it? There is any provision for such reduction? No. The law didn't contemplate it. There is no provision for such reduction. This is one of the reasons why Justice M. Srinivasan, while considering this question in Sundarambal's case itself, said a daughter is made a co-partner along with her father and not with her brothers. And if you are going to apply it to a father who had died prior to 25/3/1989, the date on which the Tamil Nadu amendment came into force, this will have an undesired effect of reducing the share of the widow as well as any married daughter who is there, because the Tamil Nadu Act excluded married daughters. This reasoning, in my humble opinion, is one of the best reasons to say that this act can only be retrospective, it cannot be prospective. These two enactments can only be prospective and not retrospective. Of course, this question again came up again and again before us, before a division bench of the Madras High Court said in 2012, File Law Weekly 378, it is only prospective. So as far as Madras High Court is concerned, the law is clear that it is only prospective. In Prakash vs. Pulavati in 2016, I referred to it earlier, Supreme Court said it is prospective, it is not retrospective. Then Prakash vs. Pulavati used a very interesting coinage. It would apply to a living daughter of a living co-partner. It was a very nice term used in Prakash vs. Pulavati. They said living daughter of a living co-partner. Therefore, unless it is shown that the father was alive on 9/9/2005 when the act came into force, the daughter would not become a co-partner. But of course, there is again a divergence of opinion on this question. Unfortunately, this question has been referred to a larger bench by the Supreme Court, and in Vinita Sharma vs. Rakesh Sharma, reported in 2019, 6 ACC, page 162, and the reference is pending. We have to wait for the answer. But again, my opinion on this would be that these two enactments must be considered to be must be given only a prospective effect and not a retrospective effect, because if a retrospective effect is given, it will adversely affect the other women heirs of the male Hindu who died prior to the coming into force of these enactments. Even if you are going to make it prospective, it will have a direct effect on the share of the widow. Who is affected is the person who is worst affected by these enactments. All the state enactment as well as the central enactment is the share of the widow gets reduced. Then another issue maybe this arises under section 16 of the Hindu Marriage Act. 16 of the Hindu Marriage Act, as we all know, legitimized children born out of void marriages, second marriages. Yeah, because as far as Hindus are concerned, polygamy was not prohibited earlier. But after the coming into force of the Madras Bigamy Prevention Act and the Hindu Marriage Act in 1955, the polygamy was prevented. Therefore, in order to save those children born out of such marriages from being called as from being bastardized, then this section 16 was enacted, giving a legitimate status to those children, and they would be entitled to succeed to their father's property. Then the question arose whether those children will also would become co-partners. In 1986, the Madras High Court said no, they would not become co-partners, but they will inherit as daughters prior to 2005 or 1989 in Madras. Then this was also, the Supreme Court also took the same view till 2011. Say, for example, Jinia Kotian 2003 1 SCC 730, Neelamma 2006 9 SCC 612, and Bharata Mata in 2010 11 SCC page 483 took the view that these legitimized, otherwise illegitimate children would be entitled to succeed only as class 1 heirs of their father to his interest in the Mitakshara Kopasanari. They would not become Kopasanas. But a two-judge bench of the Supreme Court in Revanna Siddhappa reported in 2011 11 SCC page 1 disagreed with all these statements and said this is a social piece of legislation which aims at social justice. Therefore, this should be given a better interpretation. Therefore, we think that these children should also be treated as co-partners on par with the legitimate children. And the matter was referred to a larger bench and it is pending. And even recently in Jitendra Kumar versus Jaspir Singh on 21/10/2019, another two-judge bench of the Supreme Court had pointed out that this reference is pending for long. So that is also a subject matter of reference. Then subsection 2 of section 6 again provides that new sections provides that the property will be held by a property inherited by a female as a co-partner will be held by her with all incidents of co-partnership ownership. So she will also take it. Her children will take it as a right by birth. This is a new concept. Now, right by birth has given a new lease of life after the 2005 amendment of the Hindu Succession Act, Section 6 of the Hindu Succession Act. Then there is a question. Wherever there are in states, wherever there are these amending acts in various states, we have, to my knowledge, Maharashtra has got it, Orissa has got it, Andhra has got it, Tamil Nadu has got it, Pondicherry has it. All these, sorry, not Pondicherry, these four other states also have enacted law giving all other states which came under the Mitakshara. Bengal is different, Dayabag. These states have enacted laws to confer equal rights on the daughter, making them co-partners. Then the Central Act comes in 2005, which will prevail in those states. This question arose before the Madras High Court, and in 2013 5 CTC page 49, Honorable Justice Selvam held that the Tamil Nadu Act would prevail in Tamil Nadu because it has been assented to by the President. With due respect to the learned judge, I don't think that law is correct, because if a state law, this matter of succession is in the concurrent list. Both can enact. When a state enacts a law which is in conflict with the central legislation, if the state law is reserved for the assent of the president and the assent of the president is obtained, then the state law would prevail in that state. And one of the essential ingredients is, while obtaining assent, it should be notified to the president that there is a conflict between contradiction or conflict between these two enactments. And so, if a state law is assented to by the president, even if it is in conflict with the central law, it will apply to that state. The central law will take the backseat. But what happens when a subsequently enacted central law is in conflict with the pre-existing state law? 254(2) of the Constitution of India says that mere fact that the state has legislated and the act has been assented to under section 250 under article 254(1) will not prevent the parliament from enacting on that topic. So again, the central legislation is given supremacy. If the central legislation is given supremacy, then what happens to the state law? If an existing state law becomes ultra virus to a later central law, or is in conflict with a later central law, then which will prevail? This question came up before the Supreme Court in Rishikesh with Salma B. reported in 1995 to 4 SCC page 718, where the Supreme Court went into the court. That was in relation to a CPC amendment in Uttar Pradesh. Then the Supreme Court went into the question and said the state law should be, unless the state law is reenacted and again it is submitted for assent of the president, the central law will prevail. Therefore, unless these enactments enacted by various states in 1980, between 1986 and 1984 are reenacted by the respective states and are reserved for president's assent, the central law alone would prevail. But we can make a very easy distinction. That is, if the father had died between 25/3/1989 and 9/9/2005, the state law would apply. And if the father had died after 9/9/2005, the central law would apply. That will be a very easy distinction that could be maintained by lawyers to enable them to claim a right. Then next step is burden of proof regarding co-passionary property. What is the burden of proof regarding co-passionary property? What is the burden of proof? How to prove? Suppose the law has been consistent. It says the burden is on the person who asserts that it is co-passionary property. But there is a presumption. But once it is shown, the famous saying we say, merely because there exists a co-passionary, it does not mean it possesses property. But once it is shown that the initial burden is on the person who asserts that it is co-passionary property. And if he succeeds in showing that there was a co-passionary and that co-passionary possessed properties which were capable of yielding income, which would have contributed to the purchase of these properties, then the burden shifts to the other side to show that no, these properties were not purchased out of the income of the co-passionary property. The co-passionary in whose name the property stands will have to show that he had sufficient separate income which contributed to the purchase of these properties. This is a subject matter of several decisions, and I will not burden you with all those judgments because right from Privy Council days we have judgments on this. But let me point out a very few decisions which will have a very serious impact on it. That is AR 1983 Supreme Court 846, AR 1953 Supreme Court 495, 1996 2 Law Weekly 423, and 1997 2 Law Weekly 197. Particularly this 1997 2 Law Weekly 197, that is judgment of Honorable Justice S.S. Subramani, where he said it is not enough to show that the co-passionary existed and the co-passionary had properties. The co-passioner who alleges that the property that stands in the name of a co-passioner was purchased out of the joint family properties must show that there was income and there was sufficient surplus that would have contributed to the purchase of this property. What the learned judges point out is, if there is 1 acre of land and 1 house for the co-passionary property, and there are 9 children, what is the income from this 1 acre? Because house is a non-income yielding property. What is the income from this 1 acre? What is the expenses in maintaining such a big family? What is the surplus that could have been there? So there must be evidence of surplus. But the burden or the nature of presumption varies according to in whose name the property stands. Suppose the property stands in the name of the manager or a elder member of the co-passionary, then the presumption that it is co-passionary property is little stronger. But if it is in the name of women or junior members, the presumption is much weak. Junior members, the presumption is weak. In case of women, the presumption is weaker. And if the property stands in the name of women, then it is for the co-partner, who asserts that the property belongs to the co-partner, to prove beyond doubt that the property was purchased from and out of the income of the co-partner. So this leaves us with the next question is a very interesting question. What is the nature of the property in the hands of a male Hindu? As I told you already, Section 6 makes the distinction. A portion of the property will devolve by survivorship and the other portion under age. There are two different successions. There are two different sources from which a male Hindu can get property. As we saw in section 6, it said you have to, his interest in the Mitakshara Kopasana. You have to carve out that interest. The remaining he gets as a Kopasana. And this, whatever he gets as a Kopasana, immediately he gets a son or daughter. That son or daughter will get a right by birth. That becomes a co-personary property. And whatever he gets as a class 1 heir under section 8 remains his absolute property. It was this distinction which was pointed out by the full bench of Madras High Court in Karpanjetti's case, AR 1979 Madras page 1, which was approved in Chandrasen later in 1986, where the Supreme Court approved the Madras High Court's decision which said that there are two kinds of properties. I'll give you a very brief account of Karpanjetti's case. Karpanjetti, son of Palaniyappa Chettiar. There was a partition between Karpanjetti, one single son, only son of Palaniyappa Chettiar. There was a partition between Karpan and Palaniyappa in which Karpan was allotted a share and Palaniyappa was allotted a share. This Karpan had, who got properties under the partition, had formed a Hindu undivided family with himself and his sons and wife as members, and this property was shown as his HUF property. You know, HUF is a concept known only to income tax law, which enables a male Hindu to have two assessments. One is a HUF assessment and the other is an individual assessment. When his father Palaniyappa died in 1958, after the advent of Hindu Succession Act, he gets as the sole son, as the only son, he gets the entire property of Palaniyappa by inheritance under section 8. So, he wanted to treat this property which he has inherited from Palaniyappa as a separate property and the property which he got under the partition as the property of the HU. The income tax department said no. Sorry, the wealth tax department said no. You can't do that. There must be two, there cannot be two. You are owner of all the property, so it should be one source. The Madras High Court said no. These two properties are obtained by him from two different sources in two different capacities. Therefore, he is entitled to have two different assessments. So now what happened? This has been approved by the Supreme Court. Now what happens is, when the question of partition of Karupan's estate or succession to Karupan's estate starts, then starts the problem. So the property allotted to Karupan in the partition, which is shown by him as HUF property, will devolve as his interest as a co-personary property, where his children will get a right by birth. And the property which is inherited by him as a class 1 heir after the death of his father Palaniyappa will go under section 8. So therefore, there are two different successions. So there are two different kinds of properties inherited. There are two different successions. And this is what is approved in Uttam vs. Saubhag Singh, when the Supreme Court said these two different properties are there and two different successions are there. In fact, in Shyam Narayan Prasad vs. Krishna Prasad, the Honorable Supreme Court points out that property inherited by a male Hindu as a co-partner under section 6, his children will get a right by birth in that property. Even if he is a sole surviving co-partner, he will hold it as a sole surviving co-partner, as an absolute owner, and once a son or daughter is born to him, they will get a right by birth over that property. Therefore, this makes the question of partition of such a male Hindu who gets properties, succession to properties of a male Hindu who gets properties from these two sources, one as a co-partner under Section 6 and the other as a class owner under Section 8, the division becomes more difficult because the rule of inheritance to be applied is different. The property which he gets under Section 6 would go by survivorship, and the property which he gets under Section 8 would devolve under 8 on the class owners. So this has been this is AR 1987 Supreme Court 558 is Chandarsen's case. As I told you about Karpan Chettiar, AR 1979 Madras page 1, very famous case. And this a peculiar fact, I should also point out this in the course of this lecture, that many important decisions on Hindu succession have come out of tax cases. This is one peculiar factor of because of this HUF concept which is introduced by Hindu law, by the Income Tax Act. HUF is a concept known only to income tax law. See, lot of people confuse this joint family and the Hindu undivided family. Hindu undivided family is a totally a different concept that is known only to income tax law. A joint Hindu family is totally a different concept known only to Hindu law. Please don't confuse between the two. A Hindu undivided family is a concept developed to enable these Hindus, male Hindus, who get properties from these two sources to maintain the two different identities. Suppose, take for example me. I have got properties as a son of my father, as a co-person, at a partition between me and my father. And now I have got some properties as a lawyer. And I have inherited some properties on my father's death. So I have two kinds of properties in my hands. The properties which I have inherited after my father's death and the properties which I have earned as a lawyer will be my absolute properties. And the properties which are allotted to me in the partition between me and my father, in my son by birth will get a right over those properties. So there are two kinds of properties at my hands. Two different kinds of properties in my hands now. And when my succession opens, how it has to devolve. So one part of it will go under 6, the other part will go under 8. So this distinction makes division more complicated under Hindu law. Then effect of 14.1 and 14.2. Think I'll run out of time anyway. 14.1 and 14, I'll finish in under 12 minutes. That is 1 hour and 30 minutes we'll have. 14.1 and 14.2. 14 provided for enlargement of the estate. As far as 14.1 is concerned, there is no problem. Any property got under the Hindu Women's Right to Property Act will enlarge. But 14.2 came as a matter of interpretation. Various judgments came, several judgments said the document is executed, document will govern the rights of parties, and all those things happened. Then finally, the Supreme Court came up with Tulasamma's case in 1977. That is, Tulasamma was a Sesha Reddy, reported in AR 1977, Supreme Court 1944, where the Honorable Supreme Court said that the date of the document is crucial. If the document has been if the document has been executed prior to the coming into force of the Hindu Succession Act, that is prior to 1956, it should be taken as a reiteration of the then existing law, giving only limited estate to daughters or women. So this was Tulasamma. Tulasamma said, if the document has been executed prior to 1956, whether it confers a limited estate or not, it is enlarged. So now the safest method of interpretation after Tulasamma on 14.1 and 14.2 is, if the document is after 1956 and it confers a limited estate, on the wife, then it will be a limited estate, it will not enlarge. If the document is pre 1956, even if it confers a limited right, if the female who is a beneficiary under the document has got some pre existing right over the property, then she will inherit the property. She will take the property absolutely. This could be a very safe method of interpreting the documents before. Then comes succession to estate of a female Hindu. I already told you section 15 and section 16. 16 deals with the distribution part of it. 15 pronounces who are the heirs. 15.2 says the reversion of the property. If it is from the father's side, it will go back to their his heirs, and if it is from the father and mother, it will go back to their heirs, and if it is from the husband or the father-in-law, it will go back to their heirs, to the father-in-law's heirs. That is maybe the brothers of the husband or the brothers' children. And one another very important feature which is missed out is a daughter-in-law is not made a heir of a mother-in-law. A female Hindus in a male Hindu class one heir, you will find widow of a daughter, widow of a son in class one. But when it comes to females, the daughter-in-law is not made up heir. This creates an anomaly in some cases where the son predeceases the mother. Suppose the son predeceases the mother, leaving his widow and the mother alone. Then the mother will take off, the widow will take off. Then on the death of the mother, this half share will not even a portion of that half share will come to the widow of the son. This is an anomaly because it is her husband's property. All right, his mother takes it, and on the death of the mother, if the property remains, should it not come back to his wife? No, it won't. It will go to her children. That is again the brothers or sisters of the husband. This the Law Commission under the chairmanship of Justice A.R. Lakshmanan had made a recommendation for amending this law to include a daughter-in-law as the heir of the mother-in-law, but steps are not yet taken. So this remains the succession to a female Hindu. Then the next question is the nomination. That is, we see people giving nominations in bank accounts and all that. Then this, what is the effect of that nomination has been a whole lot of litigation has come in, and now we have come to a settled position of law where the Supreme Court in 2000 Supreme Court 27 AR 2000 Supreme Court 2747 said that the nominee will take it only as a trustee of the heirs. Nominee will not get an absolute right. But a question may be asked. Suppose there is a nomination, can the bank say no? No. The bank or insurance company, whoever it is, they are bound by the nomination under the respective enactments and their Banking Regulation Act and the Insurance Act. They are bound to pay off the nominee. But the nominee will hold it in trust for the heirs of the person. That is the position of law. Then the section 22 deals with right of presumption. Then we saw preemption, where the heirs are given a right to purchase the property, and if there are two or more of them, it says public auction. Whoever offers the higher price will take it. Then section 26, it is regarding converts. As I already told you, it is the converts, children who are disinherited and not the convert himself. The first generation convert is not disinherited under section 26. Section 30 enables Hindus to bequeath property by way of wills. Then comes the question of settlements, whether a co-partner or the father can settle his interest in the co-partner's property in favor of others. The answer is a simple no, but there is a certain exception has been carved out by the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court had said that these people who inherit, can settle a reasonable portion of the property in favor of the daughters. A reasonable portion of the property can be settled in favor of the daughters. And what is the reasonableness depends on the facts and circumstances of each case. This Supreme Court said in AR 1957 Supreme Court 434, 1964 Supreme Court 510, 1967 Supreme Court 569, 1968 Supreme Court 253. These decisions take the view that a a male Hindu is permitted to settle a portion of the property, a reasonable portion of the property. But what is the reasonableness will depend on facts of each case. In 1995, 2 MLJ, page 549, a division bench of the Madras High Court said the reasonability or the reasonableness should be proved by the settlee, namely the daughter. Then comes the major question, which is setting aside alienations by the father or manager. As we know, a father or the manager of a Hindu family has got a right to the right to alienate properties for legal necessities. Suppose a father or the question that has haunted the courts as well as lawyers so far is whether a challenging co-partner, that is a co-partner who says that sale is not binding on me or it is not for legal necessity, should seek to set aside the alienation. This question has been raging controversy right from 1955, and in 1956 Madras, page 670, a full bench of the Madras High Court went into the question and said, classified the cases into two categories. One is cases where the challenging co-partner or the minor co-partners are made eo nomine parties to the sale document, and cases where the manager as the karta sells the property without the father as the karta sells the property without adding these co-partners. The full bench said, in the first case, if they are made parties to the document, they have to seek to set it aside before they seek for partition. In the second case, the full bench said it is not necessary. They can ignore the document and sue for partition. This view of the full bench was reiterated by a division bench of the Madras High Court in P.B. Ramji versus P.B. Lakshmanaswamy, reported in 1996, 1 CTC, page 661. The resultant position is that if the challenging co-partner is a party to the document, he has to seek to set aside the same. If the challenging co-partner is not a party, he can ignore it and file a suit for partition. This is the law as regards the challenge to the alienation of a co-partner. I think I have covered vast ground within this 1.5 hours. And thank you, gentlemen, for hearing me patiently. Good night.